My name is Tabitha Campbell, and at 19 years old, I married a man who was 102. Most folks would call that crazy, but what they don't know is that he forced himself on me 10 times a day, every single day for years. And times. I counted because counting was the only way I could survive it. I'm 81 now, sitting here in this same house where it all happened, where the wallpaper still holds the echoes of what I endured. People in Sparrows Point still wave at me when I walk to the mailbox, still bring me casseroles when I'm under the weather, still think I was the luckiest girl alive to marry into the Blackwood fortune. They have no idea what luck really cost me. You see, everyone thought Cornelius Blackwood was just a frail old man who needed tending in his final days. The whole town believed I'd struck gold, a young woman who'd inherit everything just for playing nursemaid to someone with one foot in the grave. They saw a practical arrangement, a kindness. Even what they didn't see was what happened behind the heavy oak door of that bedroom, where the man who could barely walk to his chair during the day became something else entirely when the sun went down. I've carried this weight for over 60 years now, and I reckon it's time someone knew the truth. Not because I want pity. Lord knows I've made my peace with what happened, but because some stories need telling, even if they're the kind that make your skin crawl and your faith wobble. This is mine, and I'm finally ready to share it with you. All of it, from the very beginning to the end that nobody saw coming. So pull up close, honey, because this isn't the kind of story you'll hear on the evening news or read in some fancy magazine. This is the kind that gets whispered between women who've lived long enough to know that sometimes the worst monsters wear familiar faces, and sometimes the only way out is through. I suppose I should start from the beginning. Back when I was still just a girl in my daddy's house on Elm Street, Sparrows Point was still as one of those towns where everybody knows everybody's business except when they don't want to know. Sits right on the Maine coast where the wind cuts through you like a blade even in summer. And the winters, Lord, the winters could freeze the hope right out of your bones. My daddy was what folks politely called a stern man. What they didn't say out loud was that his hands were heavy and his temper was worse. Mama had passed when I was 12. Consumption took her slow and painful. And after that, it was just me and him in that little house that always smelled like bacon grease and disappointment. Learned early to move quiet, speak soft, and stay out of his way when he came home with that look in his eyes. By the time I turned 19, I was desperate to get out. Not just from that house, but from the whole life that felt like it was closing in around me like a coffin. In Sparrows Point, if you weren't married by 20, people started talking. If you weren't married by 25, they stopped talking to you altogether. I could see my future stretching out ahead of me, taking care of Daddy until he drank himself to death, then living alone in that same house, becoming one of those spinster women that children crossed the street to avoid. That's when Cornelius Blackwood's proposal came through the church. Not from him directly, mind you. Men like that don't do their own asking. Came through Pastor Williams, who sat in our front parlor on a Tuesday evening, and explained the opportunity like he was offering me salvation itself. Miss Tabitha, he said, his voice all honey and holy water. Mr. Blackwood is looking for a companion in his final years. Someone to keep him company. Ensure he's comfortable. It would be a Christian arrangement, a blessing for both parties. What he didn't say was that Cornelius had been married 3 times before, and all 3 wives had died young. What he didn't mention was the way people's voices dropped to whispers when they talked about the Blackwood mansion or how the previous wives had seemed to age years in just months. But I was 19 and stupid and scared. And when Daddy heard about the arrangement, his eyes lit up with dollar signs. The Blackwoods owned half the town, the lumber mill, the fishing boats, most of the good land between here and Bar Harbor. Marrying into that family meant security, respect, a future that didn't involve scrubbing floors or mending nets for pennies. I said yes before I even met the man I'd be marrying. I said yes because anything had to be better than staying where I was. I said yes because I thought I was saving myself. God help me. Had no idea I was walking straight into hell with my eyes wide open. I thought the worst thing about marrying an old man would be watching him die. I never imagined that some people are too mean to die easy or that a body can keep going long after the soul has turned rotten. And I certainly never imagined what I'd discover about why he needed a wife so badly, or what had really happened to those other 3 women who'd worn his ring before me. First, laid eyes on Cornelius Blackwood 3 days before our wedding, and I'll never forget the smell that hit me when I walked into his parlor. Mothballs and medicine and something underneath that I couldn't quite place. Something that made my stomach turn. He was sitting in a massive leather chair that seemed to swallow him whole. This tiny ancient man with skin like parchment and eyes that were still sharp as broken glass. When he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. It wasn't the way a man looks at his intended bride with fondness or even simple appreciation. It was the way a person looks at something they're planning to own, to use up completely. His hands, when he reached out to shake mine, were surprisingly strong for someone who looked like he might blow away in a stiff breeze. The grip lingered too long, and I could feel him studying my face, my neck, the way my dress fit across my chest. The Blackwood mansion sat on the hill overlooking the harbor, 3 stories of dark wood and darker windows that seemed to watch the town below, like suspicious eyes. I had been in his family for generations, and you could feel the weight of all those years pressing down on you the moment you stepped inside. The hallways were lined with portraits of stern-faced Blackwood men and their wives. Always young wives, I noticed, though I didn't think much of it then. During those few days before the wedding, Cornelius would have me brought to the house for what he called getting acquainted. We'd sit in that same parlor while he told me about his expectations, how I'd take my meals, what rooms I'd be responsible for keeping, the importance of maintaining the family's reputation in town. His voice was thin as paper, but never wavered, and sometimes I'd catch him studying me when he thought I wasn't looking, like he was memorizing every detail. What struck me most was how alive he seemed for someone everyone said was dying. Oh, he moved slow and needed help getting up the stairs. But there was an energy about him that didn't match his age. When he talked about the past, about the early days of Sparrows Point and the timber business, his whole body would change. His voice would get stronger, his eyes brighter, like he was drawing power from somewhere deep inside. The strangest thing was how he talked about his previous wives. Most widowed men, especially those who'd lost 3 spouses, would get sad, or at least respectful when their names came. But Cornelius spoke about them like they'd been temporary arrangements, like hired help, who'd simply finished their contracts. He'd mention how each one had started out spirited, but had eventually settled into her proper role. The way he said it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. On the night before our wedding, as I lay in my narrow bed at Daddy's house for the last time, I tried to convince myself I was just nervous. Every bride gets cold feet. Told myself every girl feels scared about leaving everything she knows. Deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew something was wrong. The way Cornelius looked at me, the way the house seemed to hold its breath when we were together, the way even the servants moved like they were walking on eggshells. It all pointed to something I wasn't ready to understand. I should have run that night. Should have packed my few belongings and walked right out of Sparrows Point without looking back. But I was 19 and terrified of ending up like my mother, used up and forgotten before my time. I thought I was choosing the safer path, the one that led to security and respect. Had no idea I was about to discover that Cornelius Blackwood had stayed alive for over a century for reasons that had nothing to do with good fortune and everything to do with a hunger that 3 previous wives had already fed with their youth, their strength, and ultimately their lives. The wedding itself was a small affair, just the pastor and a handful of witnesses at the old stone church on Main Street. I wore my mother's dress, taken in twice because I was so much smaller than she'd been, and carried a bouquet of late autumn flowers that seemed to wilt in my hands before the ceremony was even over. Cornelius stood beside me in a black suit that hung on his frame like it was meant for a much larger man. And when Pastor Williams asked if I took this man to be my husband, my voice came out as barely a whisper. But it was that first night in the Blackwood mansion that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The bedroom was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway lined with those same stern-faced portraits. It was a massive room with heavy curtains that blocked out every bit of moonlight and furniture that looked like it had been carved from the same dark wood as the house itself. The bed was enormous with posts that reached nearly to the ceiling and a canopy that made the whole thing feel like a tomb. I'd expected very little if I'm being honest. The man could barely walk without assistance during the day. I'd seen him struggle to lift a cup of tea to his lips, watched him lean heavily on his cane just across a room. I thought I'd help him to bed, maybe read to him until he fell asleep, then spend my nights in the chair by the window, waiting for morning to come. What happened instead still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The moment that bedroom door closed behind her, something changed in Cornelius. Was like watching a mask fall away, revealing something underneath that had been hiding in plain sight. His posture straightened. His grip on my arm became firm enough to leave bruises, and those sharp eyes took on a gleam that made every instinct I had scream at me to run. When he moved toward me, there was nothing frail or uncertain about it. This wasn't the shuffling old man who needed help with his meals. This was something that had been playing a part, putting on a show for the whole town while keeping his true nature locked away behind that bedroom door. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The room suddenly felt impossibly small despite its size. And when I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, no sound came out. It was like my voice had been stolen right out of my throat. What followed was the first of what would become a nightly ritual that lasted for years. Not once, not twice, but again and again until I lost count. Until my whole world narrowed down to that room and that bed and the terrible understanding that the man I'd married wasn't dying at all. He was feeding. By the time the sun came up, I understood three things that would define the rest of my life. First, that Cornelius Blackwood possessed a strength and vitality that had nothing to do with his apparent age. Second, that whatever was keeping him alive required something from me that I'd never agreed to give. And third, that the other three wives hadn't died of natural causes at all. They'd been used up, worn down, drained of whatever it was that he needed to keep that ancient body moving. And now it was my turn. As I lay there in the gray morning light, feeling like I'd been broken into pieces and badly put back together, I realized that I wasn't a wife at all. I was livestock. I was a resource to be consumed carefully and systematically until there was nothing left of me worth taking. The most terrifying part wasn't what had happened. It was the dawning certainty that this was only the beginning and that somehow, impossibly, I was going to have to find a way to survive what was coming. The days that followed our wedding night blurred together like a fever dream. During daylight hours, Cornelius would return to his role as the frail patriarch of Sparrows Point. He'd shuffle slowly to his chair by the window, accept his meals with shaking hands, and receive visitors who'd come to pay their respects to what they believed was a dying man. I'd sit nearby, playing the part of the beautiful young wife, bringing him tea and adjusting his blankets while the whole town praised me for my dedication. But the nights, God help me, the nights were something else entirely. Became a routine as predictable as the tides. As soon as the last servant left, and the house settled into darkness, Cornelius would transform. The shuffling walk would become purposeful strides. The trembling hands would grip with iron strength, and those cloudy old eyes would clear with a hunger that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside his ancient body. 10 times every single week. 10 times he would take what he needed from me. And each time I felt a little more of myself disappear. Not just my body, though that act in ways I never knew were possible, but something deeper, something that felt like the very essence of who I was being. Slowly drained away. Drop by drop, I tried to understand what was happening to me. The morning, I'd look in the mirror and see shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Paler to my skin that made me look like I was fading from the inside out. My hair, which had always been thick and healthy, started to feel brittle between my fingers. Appetite disappeared, and even when I forced myself to eat, nothing seemed to give me strength. The worst part was how normal everyone expected me to act. Ladies from church would visit and comment on how lucky I was to have married into such prosperity. They'd ask about my plans for redecorating the house, about when Cornelius and I might start a family, about how wonderful it must be to live in such comfort. I'd smile and nod and pour tea with hands that shook just slightly while inside I was screaming. Mrs. Henderson from down the hill brought me a casserole one Tuesday afternoon and mentioned how much healthier Cornelius was looking lately. She said it was wonderful to see how good my care was doing him, how much more vibrant he seemed since our marriage. I nearly laughed out loud at the irony. He was healthier because he was feeding off me like some kind of parasite, growing stronger while I grew weaker. That same week I discovered something that made my blood run cold while cleaning out one of the upstairs rooms. I found a trunk filled with women's clothing, beautiful dresses in styles from decades past, jewelry that had once been carefully maintained, but now sat tarnished and forgotten. At the bottom, 3 small portraits. The faces looking back at me were young, pretty women with bright eyes and hopeful smiles. Each portrait was signed with a different name. Margaret 1892, Catherine 1923, Evelyn 1941, his previous wives. And in each painted face I could see something that chilled me to the bone. They all looked like me. Not exactly, but close enough. The same coloring, the same build, the same youth that he'd apparently been drawn to again and again over the decades. But it was what I found beneath the portraits that made me understand the true horror of my situation. 3 death certificates, all listing the same cause, exhaustion and general weakness, leading to heart failure. All 3 women had died young, none older than 25, and all after being married to Cornelius for exactly the same amount of time, 3 years. At night, as I lay in bed, waiting for him to begin his nightly ritual, I finally understood what I was dealing with. Cornelius Blackwood wasn't just an old man with unusual vitality. He was something unnatural, something that had found a way to extend his life by taking it from others. Those other wives hadn't died of natural causes. They'd been systematically drained of their life force, used up completely, and then replaced when there was nothing left to take. And according to the timeline I'd discovered, I had less than 3 years before I'd join them in the town cemetery. Another young woman who'd mysteriously wasted away, despite having every advantage that money could provide. The question that kept me awake during what little time I had to rest wasn't whether I was going to die. It was whether I was strong enough to find a way to survive what no other woman before me had managed to escape. Winter came early to Sparrows Point that year, and with it changes I hadn't expected. As the months passed and the snow piled higher against the mansion's windows, I noticed that Cornelius was growing stronger while I continued to fade. It wasn't just my imagination. He moved with more confidence during the day now. His voice carried further, and sometimes I'd catch him forgetting to maintain his frail old man act when he thought no one was watching. But it was Dr. Whitmore's visit in February that truly opened my eyes to how calculated this whole arrangement was. The doctor had been coming to check on Cornelius monthly for years. Part of what everyone assumed was routine care for an elderly man when he arrived that gray Tuesday morning. I expected the usual brief examination and polite conversation about managing Cornelius's declining health. Instead, I overheard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. I was bringing tea to the parlor when I heard Dr. Whitmore mention my name. I stopped just outside the door, the tray trembling in my hands as I listened to words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The doctor was asking about my progress, discussing my weight loss and general decline, as if it were expected, even desired. He mentioned checking my pulse and blood pressure during his last visit, and how the readings were proceeding as anticipated for this stage. When Cornelius asked about timeline, Dr. Whitmore's response made me bite my lip so hard I tasted blood. He estimated I had perhaps 18 months left, maybe 2 years if I proved particularly resilient. They discussed it like they were talking about livestock. Clinical observations about my deteriorating condition delivered in the same tone they might use to discuss the weather. That's when I understood that Dr. Whitmore hadn't just been Cornelius's physician. He'd been complicit in whatever had happened to the 3 wives before me. He'd watched them waste away, documented their decline, and signed their death certificates, knowing exactly what had really killed them. Respected town doctor was part of this nightmare, helping to cover up what amounted to slow-motion murder. But what truly terrified me was the conversation that followed. Cornelius mentioned that he'd already begun considering options for the future, and Dr. Whitmore assured him that when the time came he'd help identify another suitable candidate. They talked about the importance of finding someone young and healthy, someone without close family ties who might ask uncomfortable questions. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. I was part of a cycle that had been going on for decades, maybe longer. Cornelius had perfected a system of acquiring young wives, draining them of whatever vital force kept him alive, and then replacing them when they were used up. The whole town was complicit in their silence, either too afraid or too bought off to question why the Blackwood wives always died so young. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of lying there passively, waiting for him to begin his nightly feeding, I started paying attention to the details. I watched how his appearance changed during the process, noting the way his skin seemed to tighten, and his eyes grew brighter as mine grew duller. I observed the strange ritual aspects of what he did, the way he seemed to draw energy from specific points on my body, almost like he was following some kind of ancient formula. Most importantly, I started looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for any sign that what he was doing to me might somehow be turned against him. Because if Dr. Whitmore was right about my timeline, I was running out of time to figure out how to break a cycle that had been claiming young women's lives for over a century. And unlike the 3 wives who came before me, I wasn't going to go quietly into that early grave. Was going to fight back, even if I had no idea how. The only question was whether I could figure out his secrets before my body gave out completely, and whether a half-dead 19-year-old girl could somehow defeat something that had been perfecting its predatory skills for over 100 years. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought with it a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about the Blackwood family and the true scope of what I was facing. I'd been married to Cornelius for nearly a year by then, and my body was failing in ways that terrified me. My weight had dropped so much that my clothes hung on me like empty sacks, and there were mornings when I could barely find the strength to get out of bed. The mirror showed a stranger. Hollow cheeks, dull eyes, skin with a grayish pall that no amount of rouge could hide. I looked like I was already half in the grave. But it was while exploring the mansion's basement that I found the room that revealed the true horror of what the Blackwood family had been doing for generations. I'd gone down to the cellar looking for preserves. Something simple and ordinary. The basement was vast, stretching under the entire house with stone walls that wept. Moisture and air that tasted of centuries. Most of it was used for storage. Old furniture, trunks of documents, the accumulated debris of a family that had lived in the same place for over 200 years. But there was one door I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a stack of moldering crates. When I moved them aside, I found myself staring at heavy oak panels carved with symbols that made my skin crawl just to look at them. The door wasn't locked, but it took all my remaining strength to push it open. Inside was a room that shouldn't have existed in any normal house. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of glass jars filled with what looked like dried herbs and powders, each one carefully labeled in spidery handwriting that went back decades. There were books bound in leather so old it had turned black, their pages filled with diagrams and text in languages I didn't recognize. But it was the table in the center of the room that made me understand. I'd stumbled into something far worse than I'd imagined. It was carved from a single piece of stone, and its surface was covered with grooves that had been worn smooth by use. Dark stains marked the stone, stains that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove. Scattered around the table were more jars, but these contained things that made my stomach turn. Hair of different colors and textures, each jar labeled with a woman's name and dates. Recognized some of the names from the portraits I'd found. Margaret, Catherine, Evelyn, but there were others. Dozens of others going back over a century. That's when I realized that the 3 wives everyone knew about were just the most recent victims. There had been many more. Women whose disappearances had been explained away or covered up. Women who'd vanished into this house and never been seen again. But the most horrifying discovery was a journal written in Cornelius's own hand that detailed exactly what he'd been doing to sustain his unnatural life. The entries went back decades, describing a ritual that involved not just the physical drain I'd been experiencing, but something far more systematic and deliberate. According to his notes, the process worked in stages. First came the physical claiming, the nightly feeding that weakened his victims and strengthened him. But that was just the beginning. Over time he would harvest other things, hair, blood, even nail clippings, all of which went into the concoctions that line the shelves around me. The final stage, according to his meticulous records, involved a ceremony that would transfer the remainder of his victim's life force to him in one massive infusion. This was what had actually killed the other wives. Not the slow drain of the nightly feedings, but a final ritual that would leave him revitalized for decades while they died instantly. And according to the timeline he'd mapped out for me, that ceremony was scheduled for the 2-year anniversary of our wedding, less than 12 months away. I understood then that I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was racing against a deadline that Cornelius had been planning since the moment I'd said yes to his proposal. Everything that had happened to me, every night of horror, had been building toward a final moment, when he would take whatever remained of my life and add it to the century of stolen years that had kept him walking this earth. As I stood in that nightmare room, surrounded by the remnants of all the women who'd come before me, I made a vow that their deaths would not be in vain. I was going to find a way to stop him, not just for my own sake but for all the young women who would come after me if I failed. The question was whether I had enough strength left to figure out how to turn his own dark knowledge against him, and whether I could do it before my time ran out completely. Because one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let him add my hair to that collection. And I sure as hell wasn't going to die on that stone table like some kind of sacrifice to his unholy hunger. The knowledge I'd gained from that basement room was both a blessing and a curse. Understanding what Cornelius was planning gave me something to fight against. But it also made every day feel like I was counting down to my own execution. I began watching him with new eyes, studying his movements and habits like my life depended on it. 'Cause it did. What I discovered was that his strength wasn't constant. There were patterns to when he was most powerful and when he seemed more vulnerable. During the new moon he moved with the vitality of a much younger man. But as the moon waxed full, I noticed subtle changes. His grip would be less firm. His voice would waver, slightly. And sometimes I catch him looking almost hungry, desperate even. It was during one of these weaker periods that I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been pretending to be sicker than I actually was, which wasn't hard, considering how weak I'd become. And Cornelius had been spending more time during the day in that basement room. Knew he was down there because I could smell the strange, acrid scent of whatever potions he was brewing drifting up through the floorboards. One afternoon, while he was occupied with his dark work, I managed to slip into his personal study on the first floor. It was a room I'd never been allowed to enter, filled with ledgers and correspondence that documented decades of business dealings. But hidden behind a false panel in his desk, I found something that made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold it. It was a contract written in that same spidery handwriting I'd seen in the basement journal. But this wasn't just any contract. It was an agreement with something that wasn't human. Something that the document referred to only as the eternal hunger. The terms were laid out in clinical detail. In exchange for extended life, Cornelius would provide regular offerings of youth and vitality, harvested according to specific rituals and delivered on predetermined schedules. But it was the signatures at the bottom that made my blood run cold. There wasn't just one. There were 5, representing 5 generations of Blackwood men who had made the same bargain. Cornelius wasn't the first to make this deal. He was the latest in a family line that had been feeding young women to this dark entity for over 2 centuries. The contract also revealed something else that filled me with both terror and hope. The agreement had terms and conditions, clauses that could void the entire arrangement under specific circumstances. If the current Blackwood failed to fulfill his obligations, if the rituals were disrupted, or if the offering proved unwilling and knowledgeable of the true nature of the compact, the contract could be broken. That last clause gave me the first real hope I'd felt in months. I was unwilling. God knows I'd never consented to being slowly murdered. And now I was knowledgeable about what was really happening. The question was whether I could figure out how to use that knowledge before Cornelius completed the final ritual. But as I studied the contract more closely, I discovered something that made my newfound hope curdle into desperation. There was a penalty clause for broken contracts, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. If the agreement was voided, the accumulated years of stolen life would be reclaimed all at once, not just from Cornelius but from anyone in the bloodline who had benefited from the pact. The problem was I was now technically part of that bloodline through marriage. If I succeeded in breaking the contract, there was a very real possibility that I would be pulled down with him. My own life force, consumed to balance the cosmic debt that the Blackwood family had accumulated over 2 centuries. It was a choice between certain death in less than a year or possible death in the attempt to save myself when I put it that way. The decision was easy. I'd rather die fighting than waste away as a sacrifice to something that should never have been allowed to exist in the first place. That night, as Cornelius began his nightly feeding, I did something I'd never dared before. Instead of lying there passively, I began to push back. Not physically. I was far too weak for it. But mentally, spiritually, with every ounce of will I had left, I felt something shift in the room. A change in the air that made Cornelius pause in his ritual. For just a moment I saw uncertainty in his ancient eyes. A flicker of something that might have been fear. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that he wasn't as invincible as he wanted me to believe. The question now was whether I could find a way to exploit that weakness before my strength gave out completely. And whether I had the courage to risk everything on one desperate gamble that could either save me or damn us both. The weeks that followed my discovery of the contract were the longest of my life. Every day was a careful balance between gathering information and conserving what little strength I had left. I'd taken to carrying a small mirror in my pocket, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of myself in shop windows. When I went to town, shocked each time by how much more I'd faded since the day before. But I was learning too. Every night when Cornelius performed his feeding ritual, I paid attention to the details I'd missed before. The way he would mutter under his breath in a language that sounded older than anything I'd ever heard, the specific pattern he followed, always starting at my temples and working his way down to my heart. The way the room itself seemed to respond to what he was doing, shadows gathering in corners that should have been well lit. Most importantly, I began to understand that the ritual required my participation in ways I hadn't realized, not my consent. That ship had sailed long ago, but my life force had to be actively drawn out, not simply taken. There was a difference between being a victim and being a willing participant. And I started to wonder if that difference might be the key to everything. It was during the third week of my careful observations that I noticed something that gave me the first real plan I'd had since this nightmare began. Cornelius kept a small vial of dark liquid on the nightstand during his rituals, something he would drink from at specific intervals. According to the journal I'd found in the basement, this was a preparation made from the essence of his previous victims, a concentrated form of their life force that helped him process and absorb what he was taking from me. The vial was always the same, made of black glass with a silver stopper, and he guarded it more carefully than anything else in the house. But I'd noticed that on the nights when the moon was fullest, when his power was at its weakest, his attention to detail would slip just slightly. His movements would be less precise, his focus not quite as sharp. The next full moon was only days away, and I knew it would be my only chance. Spent those days preparing in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. Every ounce of will I had left went into maintaining the illusion that I was growing weaker while actually conserving every bit of strength I stopped eating the meals that were brought to me, instead finding ways to dispose of the food while making it look like I'd consumed it. I needed to be hungry, genuinely, desperately hungry, because hunger was a kind of emptiness, and emptiness was the opposite of what Cornelius was trying to fill himself with. On the night of the full moon, I put my plan into action. When Cornelius began his ritual, I did something I'd never done before. I actively participated, but not in the way he expected. Instead of simply lying there while he drew my life force away, I began to pull it back, creating a kind of spiritual tug-of-war that caught him completely off guard. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The shadows in the room began to writhe like living things, and I could feel something vast and hungry stirring in response to our struggle. Cornelius's eyes widened with something I'd never seen there before: genuine fear. In his momentary confusion, I managed to knock the black vial from the nightstand. It shattered against the floor, and the dark liquid inside spread across the ancient wooden boards like spilled blood. The smell that rose from it was indescribable. Centuries of stolen life. All those young women's final breaths, their last heartbeats, their dying thoughts. The reaction was instantaneous. Cornelius let out a sound that no human throat should have been able to make. A shriek of rage and desperation that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his ancient lungs. For the first time since our wedding night, I saw him for what he truly was. Not a man at all, but something wearing the shape of a man. Something that had been feeding on women's lives for so long that it had forgotten what it meant to be human. Breaking the vial had done more than anger him. I could feel the change in the room, in the very air around us. contract I'd found was more than just words on paper. It was a living thing, sustained by the rituals and offerings that fed it. And I had just disrupted one of the key components that kept the whole arrangement stable. As Cornelius advanced on me with fury in his ancient eyes, I realized that I had succeeded in breaking part of his power. But I had also announced my rebellion in the most dramatic way possible. There would be no more pretending, no more playing the role of the submissive wife. The war between us was now out in the open. I had maybe hours before he found a way to complete the final ritual that would kill me and restore what I'd just taken from him. The only question now was whether my desperate gamble had weakened him enough for me to find a way to finish what I'd started, or whether I'd simply ensured that my death would be even more horrible than what he'd originally planned. What followed that night was like nothing I could have imagined. Even after everything I'd already endured, Cornelius didn't just rage. He transformed completely, dropping any pretense of humanity he'd been maintaining. His body seemed to stretch and twist, becoming something that belonged more in nightmares than in the real world, and his voice when he spoke was like the sound of wind through a graveyard. But the breaking of that vial had done more damage than either of us had initially realized. Could see it in the way his form flickered, like a candle flame, struggling against a strong wind. Whatever essence had been contained in that black glass had been crucial to maintaining his physical presence in our world. And without it he was becoming unstable. The house itself began to respond to what was happening. The walls groaned like they were in pain. I could hear sounds from other rooms. Furniture moving, doors slamming, the very foundation of the mansion protesting against the supernatural forces that were tearing through it. Was as if the building had been holding its breath for decades. And now it was finally exhaling all the horror it had witnessed. In his fury, Cornelius made a mistake that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to complete the ritual that would have transferred my remaining life force to him, he focused on punishment, on making me suffer for what I'd done. He dragged me from the bedroom down to that stone table in the basement, and as we descended those stairs, I could feel the malevolent presence that he'd been serving growing stronger, hungrier, more impatient. The basement room looked different now. The symbols carved into the walls were glowing with a sickly light, and the air itself seemed thick with something that made it hard to breathe. All those jars, filled with the remains of his previous victims, were rattling on their shelves, and I could swear I heard whispers coming from them. The voices of all the women who had died in this place. As Cornelius prepared the final ritual, something unexpected happened. The presence he'd been serving for over a century began to turn against him. Could feel its attention shifting, its hunger redirecting itself toward the one who had failed to maintain his end of the bargain. The contract I'd found wasn't just an agreement. It was a leash. And by disrupting the ritual I'd given that cosmic entity a reason to question whether Cornelius was still useful to it. The stone table beneath me began to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward from where my body touched its surface. The whispers from the jars grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that all those trapped souls were trying to break free. Drawn by the possibility that their long imprisonment might finally be ending, Cornelius fought to maintain control, pouring what remained of his stored power into keeping the ritual on track. But he was losing ground rapidly. The entity he'd served was vast and patient, but it was also practical. If one servant failed, it would simply find another, and it was already beginning to withdraw its support from a man who could no longer deliver what he'd promised. In that moment of cosmic abandonment, I found a strength I didn't know I still possessed. It wasn't physical strength. My body was still failing, still dying from months of having my life force drained away. But it was spiritual strength, the accumulated will of every woman who had died in this room, somehow flowing through me and giving me the power to I rolled off that stone table and grabbed the nearest jar from the shelves, one labeled with Margaret's name, the first wife whose portrait I'd found. As it shattered against the floor, I felt something rush past me, presence both grateful and vengeful. And suddenly the temperature in the room dropped so fast that my breath came out in visible clouds. The effect on Cornelius was immediate and devastating. Without the support of the entity he'd served, and with the spirits of his victims finally free to act against him, his carefully maintained existence began to unravel. His body aged decades in seconds, all those stolen years catching up to him at once. But he wasn't going down without a fight. With the last of his strength, he lunged toward me, determined that if he was going to die, he would take me with him. His hands closed around my throat with surprising force, and for a moment I thought I'd failed, that we would die together in this basement room, surrounded by the evidence of his centuries-long crime. That's when I heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking words in that ancient language I'd heard him use during his rituals. But this time the words weren't about taking or binding or consuming. They were about release, about justice, about the debt that had finally come due. The hands around my throat loosened, and I watched as Cornelius Blackwood, the man who had terrorized generations of young women, who had made a bargain with darkness itself to extend his unnatural life, finally paid the price for what he'd done. But even as he crumbled to dust before my eyes, I knew that my own survival was far from certain. The entity he'd served was still out there, still hungry, and I was still bound to it through marriage vows that had been sealed with blood and terror. The question was whether breaking the immediate threat would be enough to save me, or whether I'd simply bought myself a few more moments before facing something even worse than what I'd already endured. The silence that followed Cornelius's death was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a terrible storm, when you're not sure if it's really over or if you're just in the eye of something even worse. I sat on that cold basement floor, surrounded by broken glass and ancient dust, waiting for whatever cosmic force had kept him alive to claim me as payment for what I'd done. But as the minutes passed and nothing happened, I began to realize that something was different. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the house for as long as I'd lived there was lifting, like a great breath being slowly exhaled. The whispers from the remaining jars grew quieter, more peaceful, and the sickly glow from the carved symbols began to fade. That's when I discovered the truth that changed everything. I thought I knew about my situation among the scattered papers that had fallen when Cornelius collapsed. Found a document I'd never seen before. Another contract much older than the one I discovered in his desk. This one was written in English, though the parchment was so ancient it crumbled at my touch. As I carefully pieced together the legible portions, I realized I was looking at the original agreement, the one that had started this nightmare over 2 centuries ago. But it wasn't what I'd expected. The original compact hadn't been made by a Blackwood at all. It had been made by a woman, a young bride, who had been brought to this house against her will, and had found herself in a situation remarkably similar to mine. Her name was Constance Hartwell, and according to the document, she had been the first victim, not the first collaborator. The truth was written there in faded ink. Constance had been tortured and abused by the original Cornelius Blackwood, a man who had dabbled in dark arts and had already been extending his life through unspeakable means. But unlike the women who came after her, Constance had found a way to turn his own magic against him. She had made a bargain with the entity he served, offering to become its agent in exchange for the power to punish him and all his descendants. The Cornelius Swa had married wasn't the original at all. He was the great-great-grandson, cursed to repeat his ancestors' crimes while being slowly consumed by the very entity that his foremother had made her deal with. Every woman who had died in this house hadn't just been a victim. They had been part of Constance's long methodical revenge against the bloodline that had wronged her. I had just completed her work. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been fighting for my survival against some ancient evil. I had been the final piece in a puzzle that a murdered woman had been assembling for over 200 years. Every choice I'd made, every small rebellion, every moment of resistance had been guided by a spirit who had been waiting patiently for someone with the strength to finish what she'd started. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As I continued reading through the scattered documents, I found records that revealed the truth about my own family history. My mother's maiden name hadn't been Miller as I'd always believed. It had been Hartwell. Constance hadn't chosen me randomly from the young women of Sparrow's Point. She had chosen me because I was her descendant, the last of her bloodline, the only one who could break the cycle she had created to ensure her revenge. Everything about my marriage to Cornelius had been orchestrated from the moment of my birth. My father's drinking, my family's poverty, even the timing of Cornelius's proposal. All of it had been arranged to bring me to this moment, to this basement, to this choice between accepting my role as a victim or claiming my inheritance as the instrument of justice. As this knowledge settled into my bones, I felt the change beginning in my own body. The weakness that had been consuming me for months didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Not the ebbing of life, but the gathering of power. I was no longer just Tabitha Campbell, the scared girl who had married an old man to escape her father's house. I was Constance Hartwell's heir. The culmination of a plan that had taken centuries to unfold. The entity that had served the Blackwood family was still hungry, but now it had a new master. The original contract hadn't been broken, had been transferred. And unlike the Blackwood men who had used their power to feed their own selfish desires, I had a choice about what to do with what I'd inherited. I could use it to extend my own life, to gather wealth and influence, to become another predator, feeding on the innocent, or I could do what Constance had always intended. I could use it to protect other women, to ensure that no one else would ever suffer what we had suffered. The decision wasn't difficult. I had seen too much horror, endured too much pain to become the thing I'd fought against. Instead, I began the work of dismantling everything the Blackwoods had built. I used my new knowledge to locate and destroy the remaining artifacts of their dark practices. Found ways to release the spirits that had been trapped in this house for generations, giving them the peace they'd been denied for so long. Most importantly, I discovered that I could sense other women in danger, other young girls who were being targeted by men with unnatural appetites and supernatural power. Over the years that followed, I became their protector, using the very forces that had once been used to harm them to shield them from those who would do them wrong. The people of Sparrow's Point never knew what really happened in the Blackwood mansion that night. They found me the next morning, apparently having suffered a complete breakdown from the stress of caring for my elderly husband. Cornelius's body was discovered in his bed, and the doctor, that same Dr. Whitmore who had been complicit in so much suffering, declared that he had died peacefully in his sleep. I played the part of the grieving widow, accepted the condolences of the townspeople, and inherited the fortune that came with being the last surviving member of the Blackwood family. But I knew the truth about what I'd really inherited, and I spent the rest of my long life using it wisely. Now at 81, I'm finally ready to pass on what I've learned. Not the power itself that dies with me, as Constance always intended, but the knowledge that sometimes the worst situations can become the foundation for the greatest good. Sometimes the very forces that seem determined to destroy us can be turned into the tools of our salvation. My story has reached you, sugar. It's because you needed to hear it. Maybe you're facing your own monster, your own impossible situation, your own moment, when you have to choose between being a victim and being a survivor. Remember that you're stronger than you know, that help can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the only way out is through. And if you think other women need to hear this story, if you believe these words might help someone else find their strength, then help my voice travel further than these old vocal cords can carry it. Subscribe to this channel. Share these words. 'Cause every woman who hears this and recognizes her own power is another victory against the darkness that would consume us all. Tell me, honey, what city are you watching this from? Love to know how far this story has traveled, how many hearts it's touched. Because in the end, that's how we win. Not by fighting alone, but by standing together, sharing our truths, and refusing to let anyone's story end in silence. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.